In the winter of 1847, deep in the forgotten outskirts of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a young girl was discovered sitting alone inside an unused slave cabin. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was smiling, calmly, quietly, as if she had been waiting for someone to finally open the door. Witnesses insisted the cabin had been locked for years. No one understood how the girl entered, or why she sat in absolute stillness, hands folded in her lap, staring ahead as though she could see something no one else could. When people questioned her, she refused to speak. She only repeated a single name, Marie Laveau. Not the famous woman known from New Orleans legends, but someone the locals swore had lived and died on that plantation long before the cabin was abandoned. Yet no records were found, no birth entry, no death notice, nothing that tied any woman with that name to Mississippi soil. Still, the child insisted that Marie Laveau had never left the cabin. She claimed the woman lived between the walls, watching, listening, waiting for those who had forgotten her story. The adults dismissed her words as imagination. But there was something unsettling in the girl's expression, something too knowing, too assured, too peaceful for a child alone in such a place. Years later, survivors of that plantation would confess that the girl's smile was not what frightened them most. What terrified them was that, for a brief moment, they believed she wasn't smiling at them. She was smiling at someone standing behind them. For weeks after the girl was found, the plantation workers whispered about the name she kept repeating, Marie Laveau. It spread through the quarters like a quiet infection, unsettling even the elders who usually dismissed children's tales. They warned each other not to speak the name out loud, not because they believed in curses, but because they feared the weight that name carried. In Mississippi at the time, certain stories were not merely ignored, they were forbidden. Tales of the enslaved who vanished without explanation. Tales of children who claimed to see people long after they had been buried. Tales of women who practiced old, pre-colonial traditions that white authorities labeled as dangerous, immoral, or unfit for discussion. The plantation priest, a man known for his strict discipline, visited the girl and ordered her to forget the name completely. When she refused, he attempted to force her into silence with prayer, scripture, and threats of punishment. But she remained unmoved, as if none of his words could reach her. She simply stared at him with the same calm expression and said, "You don't get to erase her." That single sentence left even the hardened overseers uneasy. They had spent decades shaping history into whatever form kept people obedient. A child pushing back against that silence felt like a violation of the order they believed was unshakable. Rumors soon spread that the priest tried to interrogate the elders in secret, not about the girl, but about the woman she kept naming. And some elders refused to answer, not out of fear of the priest, but fear of remembering. They said Marie Laveau was not a ghost story. They said she was a lesson, a warning. Long before the girl appeared in the abandoned cabin, there were quiet murmurs among the enslaved about a woman who had lived on that same land decades earlier. Her name, spoken rarely and only in whispers, was Marie Laveau. Not a priestess, not a healer, not a practitioner of rituals. The truth, as the elders remembered it, was far more dangerous. Marie was known for one unforgivable trait in that era. She did not bow. While others survived by lowering their eyes and masking their thoughts, Marie carried herself with a calm, unshakable defiance. She wasn't loud. She didn't rebel openly. Yet overseers complained that when she looked at them, they felt judged, seen, not as masters, but as frightened men pretending to be powerful. Some said she had come from a lineage that preserved knowledge older than the plantations themselves, traditions passed down quietly through mothers and grandmothers who prayed in ways that did not fit the rules of the church. She spoke rarely of these things, but the elders believed she held memories that did not belong to any single time or place. Whenever injustices occurred, Marie would stand at the edge of a field or the corner of a cabin, watching without fear. Her presence alone unsettled the authorities. They called her arrogant, dangerous, delusional. The plantation priest claimed her eyes carried too much understanding. But the enslaved whispered a different description. They said Marie Laveau carried history inside her. Not written history, living history. The kind you cannot burn, bury, or rewrite. And that, they believed, was why the plantation eventually tried to silence her. The cabin where the girl was found was no ordinary structure. The elders who survived into the late 19th century insisted it existed in a strange in-between, a space where time folded on itself. They spoke of it quietly, never to outsiders, and never to recorders of history. Inside, the air carried a weight older than the plantation. The floorboards whispered underfoot, though no wind passed through the broken windows. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and corners held shapes that were not entirely empty. The girl, when asked about the cabin, only said it was where Marie waits. What she meant was unclear. Some claimed she referred to a spirit. Others believed she spoke of a living memory, a consciousness embedded in the walls themselves. Elders recalled that those who lingered too long inside the cabin would feel the past pressing on them. Voices of women and children, long gone, murmured in tongues no one remembered. Some would leave shaken, unable to explain why they felt a life they had never lived reaching into them, touching thoughts they had not yet thought. The plantation authorities attempted to tear the cabin down, but each effort failed. Beams would collapse in inexplicable ways, saws would break, and even those tasked with demolition claimed they felt watched, judged, corrected. It became a place the community avoided, a forbidden structure, much like the name Marie Laveau itself. To speak of it aloud was to risk remembering things that history insisted should remain hidden. And the girl's quiet smile suggested that she already understood the cabin's secret, one the adults feared they would never fully comprehend. Years later, the story of the girl and the cabin spread quietly, carried by those who survived and by the children who heard the whispers. Some of these children ended up in orphanages across Mississippi, and in one particular institution near Natchez, rumors persisted of children speaking in voices that did not belong to them. They said that at night, a faint voice called from the corners, repeating a single name, Marie Laveau. Those who heard it described the tone as patient, commanding, and unyielding, as if correcting the world for forgetting her. Staff dismissed it as imagination, the kind that thrives in lonely, neglected minds. But children who heard the voice often claimed it guided them, warned them, or occasionally scolded them for speaking truths too loudly. The head matron, a woman known for her strict morality, grew obsessed with the phenomenon. She forbade the children from speaking the name, yet in the quiet hours, she could hear it herself. And those who had survived the plantation whispered to her that the girl's encounter in Vicksburg was no anomaly. The orphanage became a site of suppressed memory, a holding place for histories too dangerous to recount openly. Children there did not just carry the stories of the plantation. They carried fragments of Marie herself, though none could explain how or why. And the adults who tried to erase these fragments discovered a terrifying truth. Memory, once awakened, does not vanish. It hides, waits, and sometimes teaches lessons that no one living was meant to learn. The priest of the nearby parish, a man known for his meticulous record-keeping and rigid devotion, encountered the story of Marie Laveau in fragments over years of whispered confessions. At first, he dismissed the tales as superstition, the ramblings of children and elders clinging to memory. But the more he investigated, the more he realized something was profoundly wrong. Confessions from the enslaved, long hidden, hinted at rituals and knowledge that predated the plantation itself. There were accounts of people disappearing without trace, of voices heard through walls, and of a woman who could compel others to remember truths they had been trained to forget. All of these led back, in one way or another, to Marie. The priest began documenting in secret, fearful that even recording such histories would be condemned. What he uncovered was not merely about defiance or courage. It was a structural fracture in the very foundation of the society he served. Marie's life, and the memory of her, revealed a network of resistance, consciousness, and hidden truths running beneath the surface of a world that demanded obedience and silence. He found himself increasingly haunted. It was not fear of damnation, nor guilt over sin, but the sense that the past had agency, that Marie Laveau's presence could reach beyond the living, through children, cabins, and orphanages. She could observe, judge, and teach. By the time the priest died, he left behind notebooks filled with half-written warnings. Warnings he never dared to deliver, knowing that those who read them might awaken something the world was not prepared to face. By the late 19th century, the town surrounding the plantation had grown, its streets bustling with trade, churches, and families. Yet beneath the surface of polite society, a memory persisted, one that no official record acknowledged. Marie Laveau, the girl, and the cabin were not taught in schools, mentioned in sermons, or printed in newspapers. The town had collectively forgotten, or so it believed. But forgetting, as the elders knew, is never absolute. In the corners of homes, in attic trunks filled with letters and photographs, whispers endured. Grandmothers would catch themselves murmuring Marie's name in moments of fear or uncertainty, and shudder, as if the name itself carried weight. Children would dream of a woman watching from shadowed doorways, calm, unyielding, and silent. Some of the town's leading families were connected to the plantation, yet they avoided speaking of the girl. Weddings, births, and funerals went on, but every once in a while, a conversation would lapse, and the adults would stare blankly, as if sensing a presence too persistent to name. The historian who visited decades later described an uneasy equilibrium, a town functioning in daylight, while something deeper thrived unseen. He wrote of patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. Objects moved without explanation, rooms that smelled faintly of old tobacco and candle wax, and, in the quietest moments, children who would pause mid-play, listening to voices that no one else could hear. It was a town that believed it had erased the past, yet the past, through Marie Laveau, refused to disappear. In the decades that followed, a series of letters appeared, anonymous, untraceable, and unsettling. They arrived at homes, churches, and orphanages across Mississippi, always addressed vaguely, never signed. Those who read them described a strange sensation, as though the words were alive, moving slightly on the page, their meaning shifting depending on who held them. The letters spoke of injustices long buried, of children and women erased from records, of secrets hidden behind walls, doors, and prayers. Most strikingly, they always ended with the same line, "Remember Marie Laveau. She sees what you have forgotten." No one could explain where the letters came from. Postal routes were traced, handwriting examined. Yet each letter seemed impossibly old, ink fading and bright in impossible patterns, sometimes appearing on paper that had not existed a year before. Some adults dismissed the letters as tricks, hallucinations, or attempts at manipulation. Others, particularly those who had once lived near the plantation or in the orphanage, felt an immediate chill, as though the paper itself carried memory. The children who read the letters often became silent, contemplative, sometimes distant. They would draw images no one understood, walls layered upon walls, eyes in ceilings, hands reaching from shadows, and repeat the name Marie Laveau over and over. It was as if the letters were a bridge, connecting the living to a past that refused to remain dead. A past that whispered insistently through time, demanding acknowledgement, demanding remembrance, demanding that the stories buried by society be told again. Memory, the elders whispered, is not always voluntary. Some truths are inherited, carried silently through generations, unspoken yet undeniable. The children who encountered the girl in Vicksburg, the orphanages, and the letters were not merely learning history. They were experiencing a form of memory that belonged to Marie Laveau herself. Accounts suggest that those who resisted remembering felt unease, headaches, and sudden chills. Some would awake at night, certain they heard footsteps pacing halls where none had walked. Others would see fleeting glimpses of a woman in corners, calm and commanding, watching, never speaking, yet teaching without words. Adults, too, could not escape her influence. Families who believed themselves immune to the plantation's dark history began to experience subtle, inexplicable disturbances, misplaced objects, doors opening on their own, shadows moving with intention. Those who tried to erase the memory entirely, through destruction of letters, photographs, or diaries, found that erasure only intensified the presence. Marie Laveau, it seemed, was neither alive nor fully gone. She existed in a liminal space, embedded in the consciousness of those who had lived and those yet to come. Her life, her defiance, and the stories of the girl who bore her name became an ordeal, a test of awareness and courage. The memory demanded acknowledgement. Resistance was not only futile, it was dangerous. To forget was not possible. And for those who confronted the truth directly, the lesson was clear. Some histories are too alive to be silenced, too insistent to be ignored, and too human to be reduced to the pages of official records. In towns near the old plantation, families reported strange visitors. Not intruders or strangers, but people who seemed both present and impossible to remember clearly the next day. They arrived silently, sometimes at twilight, lingering just outside homes, watching without interaction. The elders, those who had heard the original stories of Marie Laveau, insisted these visitors were connected to her. They described them as echoes of memory, fragments of the past returning to ensure the truth was not forgotten. Some children claimed the visitors whispered instructions or warnings. Others said they simply observed, teaching patience and awareness without speaking a word. Adults were skeptical, yet unease spread. Livestock acted strangely. Doors would remain unlocked though no one entered, and household objects shifted inexplicably. Those who tried to confront the visitors directly felt an oppressive presence, as if history itself was pressing against them. Local records show little of these events, though diaries, now lost or burned, hinted at townspeople being subtly changed. Families became quieter, more observant, as though living under a constant, unseen scrutiny. And in the rare instances when the girl from the cabin appeared in these towns, she would silently walk among them, pausing at corners and thresholds, always calm, always smiling. The message was never explicit, but its intent was unmistakable. Marie Laveau, through memory and presence, ensured that history, hidden, uncomfortable, and inconvenient, would persist. Those who encountered her or her echoes could never fully forget. The past was alive, and it watched. In one isolated family that had lived for generations near the plantation, stories of Marie Laveau were passed quietly, in shadowed rooms and whispered conversations. These stories were never written, never spoken outside the home. Yet within the walls, the presence of the girl from the cabin and the memory of Marie was palpable. Children were taught to respect spaces others ignored, to notice details adults overlooked, and to listen to silence as if it carried meaning. Grandparents warned that the smallest act of disrespect could awaken the memory, and that forgetting was a danger far greater than any physical threat. The family's rituals were simple but exacting. At dawn, they recited names of ancestors no one else remembered. At dusk, they acknowledged the places where the past lingered, marking corners and thresholds with small gestures of recognition. The girl from Vicksburg, whose smile had unsettled so many, became a symbol of vigilance. She reminded them that history, once witnessed, cannot be ignored. Even among siblings, subtle behaviors betrayed the memory. A glance at a wall, a pause in speech, or a hesitation before crossing a threshold, all were signs of respect or warning. It was as though Marie Laveau herself had embedded a moral code, invisible yet unavoidable. By the early 20th century, these whispered practices had created a family attuned to the past in ways outsiders could not understand. They carried stories not recorded, memories not shared, and a knowledge that Marie Laveau's influence extended far beyond the confines of the abandoned cabin. Even the church, a place meant to offer guidance and moral certainty, could not escape the reach of Marie Laveau's story. In one Mississippi parish, clergy and congregation alike felt an unspoken unease whenever her name was mentioned, and often, it was intentionally avoided altogether. Reports suggest that sermons focused on obedience and piety, yet a subtle undercurrent of fear lingered in the pews. Parishioners who had grown up hearing the whispered tales of the girl in Vicksburg, or of Marie herself, sensed an invisible presence, as if the sanctuary were being observed by someone beyond the physical. Records from that period are sparse, as though deliberately altered. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals proceeded, but oral traditions hint at moments when prayers faltered and ministers found themselves at a loss for words. Some claimed that sacred texts seemed heavier in their hands, that passages once familiar now carried new, unsettling meanings. Families who attempted to confess their memories of Marie were met with confusion or dismissal. The priest, for his part, was known to grow pale and anxious when questions lingered too long. It was as if the church itself recognized the impossibility of erasing a truth rooted so deeply in the lives of those it aimed to shepherd. Marie Laveau's story, they realized, could not be contained by doctrine, law, or ritual. It moved through homes, schools, orphanages, and churches alike. It was a living reminder that some truths refuse to be forgotten, and that the moral structure of a town can be quietly challenged by a memory that will not die. By the 1920s, Marie Laveau's presence became almost legendary among those who knew to notice. In abandoned homes, orphanages, and corners of the old plantation, strange handwritings appeared, sometimes carved, sometimes painted, sometimes traced in dust. They were brief, cryptic messages. Remember her. Do not forget. She watches still. No one ever admitted to writing them. Yet those who found these markings reported a deep, unsettling recognition, as if the words were addressing memories they had long tried to bury. Children who stumbled upon them would repeat the messages in whispers, feeling an obligation they did not fully understand. Adults, particularly those who had lived through the plantation era, shivered at the sight. Historians who later examined photographs of these markings described patterns that defied conventional explanation. Letters elongated unnaturally, loops overlapping, sequences forming symbols they could not identify. Some suggested that the handwriting was less about communication and more about persistence, a way for the past to leave a fingerprint on the present. For families near the plantation, these writings became moral instruction. They were warnings and reminders, echoing Marie Laveau's insistence that the truths of history cannot be erased. Disobedience, ignorance, or forgetfulness had consequences beyond explanation, consequences that seemed to ripple silently through the lives of those who encountered them. And so, through walls, floors, and dust, the memory of Marie Laveau persisted, unwritten yet undeniable, subtle yet commanding, a force that could not be ignored by anyone who lived in the shadow of her story. By the mid-20th century, the story of Marie Laveau had transformed. It was no longer about a single girl in a cabin or an orphanage. It had become a pervasive, silent presence that threaded through families, churches, and towns. Those who had lived closest to the plantation remembered her, but the wider community acted as if nothing had occurred. Silence became a legacy. People avoided certain streets, glanced nervously at abandoned buildings, and spoke in hushed tones when the girl's name was mentioned. Yet, paradoxically, it was this very silence that ensured her story persisted. Each act of avoidance was a recognition of a truth that official histories had tried to erase. Children born in the shadow of the plantation carried her lessons unconsciously. They would pause mid-play, gaze at corners of empty rooms, or whisper names that seemed to arrive from nowhere. Parents dismissed these behaviors as imagination, yet some knew, deep down, that what was happening was real. Marie Laveau had imbued memory into the land itself. Even historians who tried to uncover the truth faced dead ends. Archival records were inconsistent, letters were missing, and oral histories were fragmented. Yet fragments persisted: diaries, marginalia, and occasional confessions from those too old or too burdened to hide the truth any longer. Her influence, though invisible, shaped generations. The plantation, the cabin, the girl, all had become conduits for a memory that refused to die. The lesson was clear. Some histories are too vital, too powerful, to be silenced. Marie Laveau's story was a force that demanded remembrance, ensuring that the past could never be fully erased. In the decades after the plantation era, many who lived near Vicksburg reported dreams that felt different from ordinary sleep. These dreams were vivid, immersive, and hauntingly detailed. People described walking through cabins long abandoned, hearing whispers that seemed to come from walls, and encountering a woman who was both present and distant, calm yet commanding. Children often remembered the dreams more clearly than adults, recounting events as though they had actually happened. They described the girl from the cabin, sitting quietly, her smile familiar yet unsettling, guiding them through corridors of memory that no one else could see. Adults who tried to dismiss these visions eventually began to notice changes in their behavior. Small gestures, hesitations, or warnings they couldn't explain. Some psychologists, when later consulted, called it collective trauma manifesting in dreams, a lingering imprint of history. But those who experienced the dreams themselves knew it was more than that. Marie Laveau's presence was deliberate, intentional, and persistent. She moved through generations not as a ghost or apparition, but as a memory, an awareness, a consciousness that could inhabit the thoughts of those attuned to her story. These dreams carried lessons. They warned, guided, and corrected, teaching respect for the past, attention to suppressed truths, and the power of witnessing. To forget Marie Laveau was impossible in these nocturnal journeys. And for those who awoke with her memory still vivid, the world seemed different, heavier, quieter, and full of truths that demanded acknowledgement. Through dreams, the story of Marie Laveau survived, unseen but undeniable, shaping those who listened and remembered. For historians and archivists attempting to trace the life of Marie Laveau in Mississippi, the task was nearly impossible. Official records were sparse, contradictory, or entirely absent. Census data listed families without mention of her, letters vanished without explanation, and court documents held gaps that seemed deliberate. Yet fragments persisted in the margins, diaries, faint notations, and oral recollections. Scholars who examined them described a pattern. Every attempt to contain Marie Laveau within the official narrative failed. She existed in liminal spaces, a figure present in memory but absent in formal documentation. Those who worked in the archives often spoke of unease. A researcher might leave a stack of papers on a desk, only to find the same documents rearranged upon return, as though guiding attention to particular passages. Others reported a faint, persistent sensation of being observed, yet saw no one. The archives themselves seemed insufficient for her story. They were built to preserve facts, dates, and names, but Marie's life was not just a life. It was a force, a consciousness, a narrative that resisted containment. Her defiance extended beyond death, beyond paper, beyond the limitations of those who attempted to record her existence. Some scholars who encountered this impossibility began to whisper, cautiously, that the story was not meant to be fully documented. It was meant to be remembered in fragments, passed through memory, dream, and warning. In that way, Marie Laveau survived as both history and myth, a presence too persistent for archives to hold, too vital for society to forget. The most persistent accounts of Marie Laveau describe her not as a distant memory, but as a presence embedded in the very fabric of spaces she inhabited. The girl in the cabin had spoken of her living between the walls, and elders insisted this was no mere metaphor. Those who dared spend time alone in the old plantation house reported sensations of observation. Doors that were closed would creak open. Faint outlines would appear at the periphery of vision. Some claimed to hear her voice in the timber and plaster, gentle yet firm, instructing, guiding, sometimes scolding. Families who grew up near the site spoke of patterns in their homes that reflected Marie's lessons. Thresholds marked subtly, corners left untouched, certain rooms avoided. It was as though she had left herself in the architecture, a moral compass embedded in walls and floors. Even as buildings decayed, her presence endured. When renovation attempts occurred, workers reported sudden chills, tools misplaced, or inexplicable noises that caused them to abandon projects. Those who remembered the girl's story said it was not hostility that Marie exhibited, but vigilance. She preserved the memory of the past, ensuring that the injustices, secrets, and suppressed histories could not be erased. The walls became her medium, the house her canvas. She existed where memory and space intersected, shaping behavior, enforcing attention, and reminding those who lived nearby that history is alive in subtle, persistent ways. And through the girl's smile, passed down stories, and whispers in the walls, Marie Laveau's presence became a warning. Some truths cannot be hidden, no matter how deeply you bury them. By the mid-20th century, the story of Marie Laveau had evolved into a quiet curriculum, taught not in schools, but through observation, habit, and ritual. Families, churches, and orphanages that had encountered the girl or her influence carried her lessons in silence. Children learned to notice what adults ignored: the slight movement of shadows, the faint traces of handwriting, the way rooms felt heavier in certain corners. They learned that some names carried weight, that some stories could not be erased, and that memory was both a responsibility and a burden. Adults, too, learned from silence. They would pause in conversation when the name Marie Laveau arose, remembering the warning carried through generations. To forget is to invite disquiet. Some claimed that ignoring her memory brought unease. Objects shifted, footsteps echoed where none walked, and dreams intruded upon sleep with lessons unbidden. The teaching of silence was not passive. It demanded vigilance, attention, and respect. It enforced morality through awareness rather than punishment, and it preserved history through subtle means. Those who understood it recognized that Marie Laveau's presence had become a guardian of memory, ensuring that the truths buried by society would survive, even if hidden from the public record. Her story, though fragmented, had become eternal. The smile of the girl in the cabin, the whispers in orphanages, the letters and handwritings, all were manifestations of a single lesson. Some truths are too important to be silenced, and the past, once acknowledged, refuses to be forgotten. Today, the story of Marie Laveau in Mississippi exists mostly in whispers, fragments, and the shadows of forgotten spaces. No official history acknowledges her. No textbooks recount her presence. No archive preserves her life fully. Yet her memory endures, alive in the minds of those who listen, those who remember, and those attuned to the lessons she left behind. She exists not as a ghost, nor a legend to entertain, but as a force embedded in the consciousness of generations. Her influence stretches from the abandoned cabin in Vicksburg to the orphanages, to the homes and churches that carried her name in silence. Those who encounter the traces of her presence report a subtle unease, a sense that history itself is observing them. Her legacy is a warning and a testament that some truths cannot be erased, some injustices cannot be buried, and some lives, though unrecorded, shape the moral framework of communities for decades. Marie Laveau's story teaches vigilance, respect, and the necessity of remembering. The girl who smiled in the dark was not simply a child. She was a conduit, a vessel through which Marie's memory continued to live, watch, and guide. And as long as someone remembers, whispers, or notices the unseen, Marie Laveau endures. Her story is not confined to time or place. It is a living memory, an invisible force, and a reminder that history, no matter how deeply hidden, refuses to die. And those who dare to remember will carry her presence forever, a quiet yet unstoppable testament to truth, defiance, and resilience.